to the work that you're doing. So I'd be curious if you could share that with the group.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalie. It's really a pleasure, to be with everyone. Like many familiar faces, many new ones. Really great opportunity to speak and to chat with everyone. Well, yeah, I think you made an introduction saying that civil society in Serbia is well established. It has been well established. It has a long tradition. We have organizations that have been operating here for almost 30 years. Starting from the anti-war movement whatsoever. But to some extent, donors adjusted to this situation. We had a really professional, very well-developed civil society, especially organizations that focused mostly on policy and advocacy. And for example, in terms of donors policies, since we are the country which is within the EU integration process, or at least we were formally, most of our funding was relying on EU funds and US funds, and we're pretty project-oriented with lack of long-term projects and also no core funding whatsoever, especially for the last 10 to 15 years. But what we did not expect were these external factors, one actually being democratic backslide that our country is starting to face. And that is something that, we kind of starting as a sector to prepare, learning from experiences, mostly from the region, even from the European Union, for example, from Hungary. And that is something that we could, as a civil society sector here, prepare in terms of our activities and direction of our advocacy, most of all, when it comes to decision makers. On the other hand, COVID was something that was not expected by anyone, either donors or civil society, and we had a really different understanding of the circumstances from the donor side as well, when it comes to a situation in which the civil society was operating, starting with COVID. Some donors even did not have understanding, that our work had to change due to different circumstances. And it took us months, for example, to convince some of them that we need to reorganize and that they need to demonstrate more flexibility towards our operation as well. All of these changes, of course, influenced the change in the environment that consequently caused changes in the landscape. So we started to deal with fundamentals, which brought more and more grassroots, local organizations, movements, activists dealing with fundamental rights in their local communities, dealing a lot with environmental issues, for example, which was something that was pretty novel in the country and in the Western Balkan regions, and which actually required a novel approach, both by donors, but also by, as you mentioned, well-established organizations that have the tradition on supporting other civil society or small organizations, specifically in local communities as well. We needed some time to adjust. I have to say that, at least from my point of view, that civil society demonstrated a significant resiliency in this regard. What we needed to, and we're still discussing that with donors as well, is our different understanding on what civil society resiliency actually means. Through these discussions, we realized that for some donors, resiliency of civil society means our ability to adapt and our ability to deliver. For us, it's definitely our ability to adapt. It's our ability to survive. It's our ability to learn. It's our ability to advance. And within these discussions, I think we are learning that we need to have the similar understanding of what resiliency actually is, which brings us to different types of support than the civil society actually needs in order to become resilient. Most of the time, we get this understanding from the donor side that we need to strengthen our capacity, most of all, like in terms of skills and programmatic knowledge and capacity, to be able to influence the environment we are operating, to be able to advance and make the civic space more open and more friendly for civic activism in general. Not, or at least it just happened recently, that some donors are also understanding that in addition to increasing these capacities, we also need to focus on developing increasing capacities and organizational capacities of civil society, that we don't need only the skills to address different types of civic space issues, that we need capacities to address different types of organizational challenges that we're facing. Some even being more technical, like different types of labor issues that we need to address, cybersecurity, tax and administration issues that we are facing on a daily basis. Like 5 or even 2 or 3 years ago, none of the donors actually understood that this is something that we need resources to work further on in order to be able to operate on a daily basis, and in order to be able to address all the issues that are actually closing our space for civic activism, in our societies. And that is actually what is recognized through our joint program, Civil Society Resiliency activity, that is funded by USAID and Swiss Development Agency. We want to tackle both. We want to work together with civil society, both in national and local communities as well, to address the issues that are influencing civic space, to be able to influence policies, decision-making processes, changes to regulations that are affecting civil society's operation in the country. But we also want to address these organizational, not only managerial, but also human aspects and technical aspects of the operation of the civil society, to make them more prone to different type of external pressure, and also to make them to be able to further improve their programmatic capacities. And we can't do that without having healthy organizations. And there's a number of interventions that we are actually planning to deliver, because it's a 5-year program. But two, they're probably most important to mention within this discussion, our House in Order program. That is the program that we actually create to address different types of, we call it compliance gaps. It sounds a little bit of like a business term. We try to avoid it, but in the end, as we need to improve our business operations, we also need to bring a little bit of a business culture into the sector itself as well. But we also want to improve the state of compliance with different types of regulations that apply to civil society, in order to make it more prepared to different types of pressures coming from, in our case, from the state actors most of all. But I'm guessing that in different environments, these pressures can come from corporations as well, and different types of other actors. So for us, working on our compliance is a matter of improving our organizational capacities, but also it is a matter of being prepared to different types of external pressures that we are witnessing throughout our work. So within the House in Order, we will work on compliance in labor, tax, finance, as I mentioned, cybersecurity, safety at work, etc., different types of regulatory requirements that we need to adopt in order to be operational. The other intervention is actually a dialogue process that we want to initiate with the donors community, but also with different types of business associations gathering philanthropists, parts of the business community in general, where we want to discuss what resilient funding actually is, to try to get to this joint understanding of what resilient funding is for donors, for businesses, for citizens as well, and for civil society, in order to mainstream the future funding in this part of the world, trying to envisage what the future challenges would be, which is pretty difficult, I have to say, but trying to adopt at least our capability to adjust to these external developments that we are facing now almost on daily basis. So I'm also open for all the questions, and I apologize in advance if I took too much time.
Thank you, Anna. And I think you're all doing really well with time because we are getting close to that point, but we're going to get through it. A lot of great information. I think this emphasis is very important. You know, it's about getting funding, right? But what's the functionality that you need to manage that funding? So I think it should be something that speaks very loudly to donors, because if that investment is going in, the return on that investment is only going to be higher if there's a capacity to process that information. And so a lot of it is that balance between facing regulatory compliance issues on the ground that it really are not often considered when that money passes through. So thanks for bringing that up, Anna. And the work that is being done on that project is also something that will be shared, and there will be a document included in the notes that that we're sharing with you all. I think a perfect segue over to Carol, who is basically heading the civil society work at Peace Nexus Foundation in Europe. We know Carol very well, and she is somebody who understands deeply all of these complexities. And Peace Nexus has done such a great job really stepping back and trying to be a partner to civil society organizations as they are encountering these kind of challenges in the phases of their growth. So Carol, I'm going to send it on to you now. Thank you, Anna.
Great. Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to speak here and to reconnect with the Partners Network. So as Rosalie said, Peace Nexus, we're a small foundation. We're based in Switzerland. We actually work beyond Europe. We work in a number of different regions, but what stands us a little bit apart from others is that we only provide organizational change support. Other funders now started to incorporate it as a complement or as a condition to programmatic funding. We offer it as a standalone support. And so when we deal with civil society partners, we select them just for that. We select them through an open call, and they come to us. They're the ones who ask for that support, feeling that they need to invest internally so that they can be more effective and impactful in their peace building interventions. And that makes for a much more equal relationship because they can walk away at any time. Their programmatic funding is not at stake. We're just a small, an unusual partnership, but not an existential one. They come to us when they need to rethink their strategy, their governance, their internal structure. It's often a matter of adapting internal systems after a period of growth, or when there's a change, a founder leaving, for instance. And at the international level, we stress now the need for INGOs to truly embody their internal, the values they profess into the internal policies and practices. So our support now with international partners is very much, well, on the intermediary roles that Erin was talking about, but also on what is called now diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to really ensure that they play their role in a way that doesn't reinforce an equal power relationship, but actually disrupts them. So the role we play is, I mean, the funding we provide can cover costs as consultants, meeting costs, not salaries. And because the idea is not to create a dependency. And we play what we call the critical friend role, where we help the organization sort of create internal space for important conversations. Often we sort of partner with an internal champion. Easier if it's the leadership, sometimes it's not the leadership, but sort of building momentum for change, building credibility for it, legitimacy for it, and modeling through the change process the values that they aspire to: transparency, accountability, participation. This support takes time, but it does deliver results. We've just had an evaluation, and we have good results to report on. It's harder to attribute it to indirect changes on the ground, which is our ultimate goal. But you can work around that, so sort of showing the organization before OD support and after, and sort of on that basis say, well, the organization we found 2 years ago would probably not have been able to deliver the kind of results that you see. But there are conversations on how to best to do that, and I'm happy to go to speak about that more. So without wanting to go too much more into the details, I'll also just direct you to 2 papers. There's a organizational development and peace building practice paper that is on our website. I will put it in the chat. And of course, the Partners Network reflection paper, as they went through a network strengthening process with us over a few years ago. And this meeting is a reflection of how vibrant the network now is, in part due to their efforts to really rethink their mission and governance model 2-3 years ago. What I wanted to just mention is that a lot of my time now is actually focused on trying to convince other donors to integrate some of these practices, and a lot in the philanthropic sector where they have a bit more freedom, but also with governmental ones that can do that too. And as the localization agenda gains momentum, it's clear that it does require a change in internal practices, a rethinking of roles, and that doesn't just happen without a proper process. It would even defeat the whole agenda if it's not the result of a co-created participatory process. So I think there is space for this conversation, and I'm happy to talk to other donors, but I wanted to sort of end on some messages for those seeking that donor, because there's much more demand than there is supply still at this time. One thing I wanted to say is that to really distinguish OD from core funding, for some reason, or sometimes quite arbitrary, if you ask me, core funding is just not available. But organizational development funding can be still, I think, asked for and presented it as a finite change process that has very specific objectives where there can be indicators of progress. It's very much designed in the same way and implemented in the same way as a peace building intervention. I consider it as a peace building intervention because it really, the outcome of it is a more effective, congruent, impactful peace builder. So don't hesitate to ask for it. It may be crossed out, but it's also asking for it is a way of also educating donors. And when you argue for it, also present it as a risk mitigation strategy, because that's what it is. I mean, I think we've heard from the previous speaker, you cannot, in an unpredictable, increasingly hostile environment, you cannot just demand that organization adapt and influence and respond without investing in the capacities of that organization. Resilience is something to invest in. She talked about having your house in order. I like to talk about a car. If you have a car, at first you just put fuel and it will go. But if you want it to keep going after many years, you have to have ongoing maintenance. You have to replace a few parts, check in with the garage from time to time, and expecting it to keep going without any care is ludicrous. So having a sort of a clear, well thought through organizational development ask, for me, is something that we need to really push for, and it's a proof of sound management and anticipatory governance. So I'll stop here because I'm sure there'll be many questions, but I hope that gives some courage, knowing that it's very needed by many of you. Thank you.
I think it's thank you, Carol, for that. Whether it's house in order or the car, I think we all feel, I think we have both a house and a car we want to keep in order. And it is encouraging when, we hear that there are a variety of, the goal of this is really to demonstrate that there's a lot of access to resources and they're not all the same. And so it's really also our job in the civil society sector to get around, to understand what the different funders and partners have to offer. But I think that message is very clear, not to be afraid to ask. And I do believe that even if it's a bilateral donor, it's very clear now with Closing Space that we are, as Partners Network would say, we are all peace builders. And the ability to mitigate that conflict or mitigate that challenge is a core skill that we all could benefit from. So thank you, Carol. I'm going to move on now to Marie-Laure Paré with GPAC. And what's very fascinating with what you're doing, Marie-Laure, if you can talk a little bit about it, is you've got this large network of very diverse organizations in different places, just as we do. But you've been working on a very specific initiative that I think really speaks to many people on the call. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Marie-Laure.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening. And thank you so much for inviting GPAC today to join this very impressive panel to talk about very timely and important issues. So indeed, we are a global network of more than 240 local grassroots civil society organizations. And yes, for a large number of these members, GPAC often acts as an intermediary, and it's in this capacity that we know firsthand how increasingly challenging it is for local organizations to directly access funding. And of course, because funding mechanisms are still too complex and demanding and restrictive, well, local partners often have to rely on intermediary like organizations like GPAC and others, NGOs, to access donor funding. And it's forcing them into a subcontractor position. And it's also undermining their agency and ability to sustainably drive their own change. And their own change process. And yes, Erin said it, and Carol is also speaking to other donors. So there is a willingness and agreement that change needs to take place. However, what we see is that ongoing efforts that are currently being undertaken so far to change the aid system, these efforts are fairly slow and remain mostly policy oriented and primarily involving donors and aid agencies that have a stake in the existing aid system and not necessarily local peace builders who are central for GPAC to the discussion. So that's why 2 years ago, we decided to proactively engage with local peace builders, donors, and financial experts from peace building sector, but also outside, because it's important to learn from other sectors. Well, to think of pathways to advance effective financing for local peace building. So what does resilient funding mean for GPAC really? Well, for us, it's really directly linked to the quality of financing, as well as to the power balance between local partners, intermediaries, and donors. So concretely, to enhance the quality of financing, well, funds have to be made available in a participatory, accessible, flexible, and sustained way. That's also what Carol said about core funding or organizational funding. As to the power balance between local partners, donors, and intermediaries, well, it needs to shift really so that local partners are in the lead of the program design and implementation. So following consultation and meetings and calls that GPAC has conducted over the last 2 years, we produced a few publications. I will put that in the chat after, that set out principles and recommendations to ensure quality financing and also to support in a shift in the power balance. And building on this publication, where we're currently developing a pilot mechanism which will bring together donors, agencies, and local peace builders together test innovative approaches for financing local peace building. I mean, it is developed. We're speaking with donors currently to see whether or not they'll be interested in supporting and testing that mechanism. So the pilot mechanism is based on 3 basic principles that local partners, donors, and intermediaries should adopt. So principle number 1, Yes, the partnership should reflect collective priority setting, co-design and programming, and of course, encourage continuous reflection and adaptation. It's very important in the peace building sector. Second principle, well, partnerships should base peace building success on locally generated understanding of impact, not donor thinking of what impact means. And then third principle, partnerships should support the long-term sustainability of local partners. So could go on into more details, but I can give you an example, at least for the first principle. I'm looking at the time. I want to remain under 5 minutes, so we have a bit of time for the discussion. So for example, principle number 1, to create space for collective priority setting, co-design and programming, and continuing adaptation. Well, donors, intermediaries should consult local partners in the preliminary stages of designing a call for proposal. It's starting. We know a few donors are doing that now, which we appreciate, but it's not yet a practice across the board. But USAID, I think, is doing that. We've seen it in few regions. Well, donors and intermediaries should compensate local partners for their participation in designing proposals. To not be too extractive. And also, well, donors and intermediaries should include objective and progress markers that strengthen the institutional capacity of local partners. We're not seeing that either, but something to consider. So that's it. I have other examples for the 2 other principles, and but I'll leave it at that. If you have more questions, we can have a conversation about it, and or you can reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to discuss that. But yes, concrete recommendations that are there for you to take into account, into consideration. But thank you again, Rosalie.
No, thank you so much, Marie-Laure. And I think if you haven't posted them here, we have the documents, and it's so well thought through. It's just very impressive what you have been doing already within your network, and that's a lot of organization feedback. So I really appreciate it. It's this idea of inclusivity. I think those in the room here, the donors that we have here, obviously on the, again, I keep saying the cutting edge, but these are really people that are sticking their necks out, kind of working against the grain and trying to make that change happen, and which is often really difficult in a bureaucratic setting. But those concrete recommendations attached to a number of, organizations that have provided that input, it's the numbers that make that compelling argument finally change practices. So thank you for that. I just want to quickly say to those of you that are not speaking English or Spanish, I know HP, I don't know your name, but just came on. Just briefly, je suis désolée que c'est pas en français, mais nous allons faire les notes en français, traduire et partager avec tout le monde après, si ça va avec vous. Mais j'espère que vous allez rester. Peut-être que nous pouvons trouver un petit groupe avec des francophones. So, Monsieur HP, je ne sais pas si c'est ton HP computer, comment vous appelez, mais on parlera après. So if there's anyone else in another language besides French, we can try to get the notes to you in French or your language. So moving on, I want to go to the Senior Director for Peace Building at Humanity United. That's Mr. Jesse Eves, who's up on the top of my screen. I think this is a good opportunity. You have a lot of peace builders here talking because we're all in this space. But again, this applies to any kind of participatory development approaches with any organization. So Jesse, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and I think you will find a lot of the similar themes that we've heard throughout the conversation already. And I think one of the questions put to us is, as we're trying to reimagine a peace building system where international cooperation on peace and violent conflict is defined by those living closest to the conflict, and for us, that commitment to making sure that those closest to the conflict are defining what peace actually looks like. I mean, that has fundamentally influenced our funding model and our strategy. And so it really forces us to understand all the different ways that a US-based foundation can support people who are not from a US registered nonprofit, a 501c3, or they don't have a US bank account. And so it means we have to be flexible and really explore all the tools that we have at our disposal in a way that best serves what our partners need. And so today, I just want to quickly touch on kind of what we're addressing, an example of how we fund, as well as what we've learned about our role as a donor in a way that tries to help build resilient funding to local partners. And I should just mention, this is how we are trying to be. I'm not saying we're always successful at it, but I've really enjoyed this so far because, again, you're going to hear, I think, several recurring themes that have already come up today. So I won't dive too deep into some of them because they've already been covered. But one of the things about our approach as a private US-based philanthropy, where we have to recognize the huge challenges that humanity faces today are all interconnected. And so from a strategic standpoint, that means finding multiple entry points to address those interconnected challenges. And so the dynamics that we're talking about today that impact the resilience of funding civil society, you see these dynamics replicated from the very hyper local level all the way up to the global level and back again. So it almost looks like a giant infinity sign. So that means we have to find multiple but focused entry points that loop back to achieve our goal of local peace actors playing a leading role in deciding and acting on what peace looks like in their own context. So again, that means being flexible in what we fund. And I think maybe a dive into our funding in Colombia will demonstrate what I mean. So Colombia's 2016 peace accord is one of the most comprehensive, if not the most comprehensive, peace deals in the world right now. But for it to work, it can't just work for those that picked up a gun, right? Like those communities that were impacted by decades of violence and war need to see positive change. So there were multiple levels that we've been funding at to try to make sure that those communities see the change that they want. So that includes support for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that collected stories of the impact of the war from across the country. It means supporting the Peace Accord Matrix, which is a way to measure how the peace deal is actually being implemented. Through our 501c4, or our kind of political arm of Humanity United, we've supported lobbying efforts for the FARC to be taken off the terrorism list so funding can go to the hardest hit places. We fund a consortium of local and international NGOs that are creating what they call the grounded accountability model, which seeks to embed a culture of accountability within the monitoring and evaluation practices of INGOs to ensure that they're not extractive and that they are following how local communities define peace. There's also support to a network of community foundations and local Colombian organizations. So local communities, again, can self-support the work that will best make the peace deal a reality in their community. So each of these is a specific point of entry, and each requires a specific mode of funding. And so we do support through traditional grants. We provide equivalency determinations to Colombian-based organizations, which means they can receive unrestricted funding from a U.S. donor without the heavy burden that often comes with receiving that funding. We support a for-profit entity that convenes a brain trust of Colombian civil society actors from all levels of civil society. And we also support efforts of collective action around implementation of the peace deal. And so we don't do this in every country where we work in, but I just want to give you an example of how that funding model adapts based on what's needed. And so to support our partners, there are kind of three main ways of support. First is flexible grants. So we want to support local peace builders who are thinking, planning, preparing for long-term success, while also wanting them to be able to meet windows of opportunity as life happens. And so that requires a blend of both short and long-term support. So if partners want, like we can provide short-term grants that fill specific gaps. We also try as much as possible to give multi-year unrestricted grants so that they can adapt as life happens and create the internal structures that are needed to succeed. And there's also a critical element of making sure that organizations have the funding to take care of their own people, to care about the well-being of those that are doing the work on the front lines. This can include, as I mentioned, grants, the follow IRS rules for private foundations, which are very strict. But I think it's important to mention that it's not just about being a good grant maker, which has been very important for us to be able to know what some of the tools we can offer. But we also have to incorporate support beyond the check. And that has meant focus in three critical areas: accompaniment, network building and support, specifically of what we call translocal networks, which this group is a great example of, and explorations into what we call sufficiency. So accompaniment is just about how we show up and walk alongside our partners. So rooted in deep conversation with the people that we work with, we identify ways to support outside of direct funding. So that can mean helping to analyze trends, bringing together different ideas that we're seeing from across all our bodies of work, helping to facilitate collaboration and alliances, providing fundraising support or other technical support like translation, or also offering the option of not doing written reports so that people can actually focus on the work they want to do. It's all about asking what serves the partner to achieve their goal. And then that second piece of network building and support. So really wanting to either build or support strong networks of international, regional, national, and local organizations that are all working around that shared goal of locally driven peace. So that can mean peer-to-peer exchanges. That means convenings, paying for travel and accommodation for partners to attend conferences. And I think as I mentioned, like one of the biggest multipliers has been the support of what we call translocal networks, so spaces where people can share their wisdom and experiences about what it's like to work in the current system and almost function like a social movement, building solidarity and issuing demands into that system, which can often do so much harm. And as I wrap up, there are, I think, those forms of support have elevated two critical themes for us that allow us to judge and work on the resilience of our partners and ourselves. And so the first is governance. And I don't mean sitting around like a white dominated boardroom talking about conflicts of interest. When we say governance, I'm talking about how do we show up together? The governance is the process by which people determine the norms and the rules that guide people's everyday life and behavior. So it's the spoken and unspoken agreements we make, the rituals that we do together that deepen our ability to achieve our vision for the future. So that can include how we choose to use our resources together, how we choose to build systems and structures that reflect our shared values. But it's a way to take power from people that look like me and create space for indigenous ways of knowing and being together. And I think there are three critical questions that we've learned we can ask that give us an indicator of how networks and coalitions in particular can remain resilient. And so we'll talk about like, okay, what do we want to accomplish? How will we make decisions? And what will we do when we disagree? This goes to the functionality that was mentioned earlier and the internal processes that are needed to achieve a goal. So people will work in the way that's most comfortable to them, in the way that best fits their culture and their context. But as you start asking these questions, you can quickly learn which groups are set up to be resilient and which ones may be headed for trouble and may need specific areas to focus on. And then I'll quickly just say that the final area that I talked about, exploring what we call sufficiency, is really about the ability of local actors to use the relationships and resources around them before seeking foreign funding. So for example, in Colombia, funding a network called Territoria, which has formed a network of community foundations, so local communities can support the work that best makes the peace deal a reality in their community. So I'll wrap up right here because my time is up. I think as we've shifted and adapted our funding model, it's meant a much greater acceptance of risk, which is often a huge issue for bilateral donors in particular. And it's led to three lessons on our role as a donor. So the first lesson is we have to give up control. We have to follow the agency and demands of those closest to the work. Second lesson is being comfortable with ambiguity. Systems change doesn't happen through predetermined outputs and outcomes. Like, it comes from action and learning and adaptation. And it also includes being flexible with figuring out collaboratively what form of support best serves the partner. And the third lesson is, as we've heard multiple times today, this takes time. The root causes of violent conflict are transnational in nature and they're relational in nature. That requires responses that seek to build and transform relationships, and those relationships move at the speed of trust, and trust takes time. So, we quickly realized long ago that systems change doesn't happen in one-year grant cycles, and so we have to shift accordingly to make sure that the organizations and partners we support have the tools they need to use their agency and power to achieve change in their context, and ideally in the system that we all work within. So as these lessons shift our funding model, they're allowing us to try to be more flexible and adapt as our partners need us to. And that's a journey filled with learning and lots of unlearning. But it's allowing us to use our unique position as a donor to work towards that goal of locally led peace while being a partner we hope our grantees can trust.
Thank you, Jesse. I mean, I think that perfect segue into our final speaker. And I know we're a little over, but we're going to manage the small groups and we're going to get everybody the time to participate as you choose to. I think Jesse's, a lot of resounding similarities that we're hearing here, which means that this is a group of, of like-minded organizations, but it is the power of the movement. So I would just encourage all of us to take that kind of advocacy approach and really continue this. This is what the purpose of this discussion is about, is not to stop here. So I think the pivot now, to talk to Nate, and it's Hawken. I'm going to say Hawken. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Is it Hawken or Hicken?
Oh, any way you like. I pronounce it Hawken.
Okay. I'm gonna say Hawken. Why we really wanted you guys to get a chance to hear from Nate about a new index that they are working on, like the role that Nate plays as Vice President for Research and Innovation at Fund for Peace. And I think that it's the index that he's going to talk about, like, really applies directly to what we would say would be sectoral level resiliency, but also drill down to organizational level resiliency and, the smaller sector of civil society that we're talking about. And it will help all of us to make our case if we're able to kind of utilize tools and analyses that others like the Fund for Peace have worked on. So I'm going to hand it over to you to wrap up this session and then open it up to questions. Nate.
All right, thank you, Rosalie. I'm going to share my screen real quick. And try to just go through this pretty fast. We've been doing the Fragile States Index every year now for about 17 years. And we realized, over the last several years, along with all of you, that there's something missing when we look at, country stability through the lens purely of fragility. Certainly after 21 years, and $2 trillion in Afghanistan was much, much less resilient than anyone may have anticipated or hoped. And despite being invaded by one of the world's largest countries with one of the largest militaries in the world, Ukraine was much more resilient than what we would have expected. And the US had been expected to be one of the most prepared countries to face a pandemic before 2020 hit. And certainly we were much less resilient than what we expected. And so, clearly we are missing something. And so what we tried to do is we tried to develop a new index to try to help us get at what it is that we're missing, because certainly the intensity and frequency of shocks is increasing. And so we need to solve this problem fast if we're going to figure out how to do development better around the world. And as we've learned, a strong military, lots of money, lots of doctors, lots of engineers, that's important, but that's not going to solve the problem because you can have all that and still not be resilient. So we need to focus on things like localization and all the things that you've been talking about over the course of this day. So what we tried to do is try to develop a tool that would help us begin to think about these questions, to try to get at what it is that we need to look at if we're going to be more resilient and promoting resilience around the world. So one thing, clearly, resilience is not the absence of crisis. Every country in the world will face a crisis. The fact that you have a natural disaster, or the fact that you have even a political crisis, or even the fact that you have some sort of migration, issue, this does not mean that you are not resilient. So because of the fact that every country in the world will face a crisis from time to time. However, what we're trying to get at with our tool is to look at resilience as the extent to which a country can prepare, manage, and recover from a crisis relative to the severity of that crisis. So when a shock hits a resilient country, the crisis will be less severe. Hopefully, the crisis will be less likely to cascade and compound across all the different sectors and dimensions. Recovery time will hopefully be faster, and the crisis is less likely to be recurrent. So if you have a resilient country, you face a crisis. Sometimes, in fact, a crisis can help you become more resilient. And we've certainly seen that in West Africa after Ebola. We saw that in Indonesia after the tsunami. A crisis can make you more resilient if you have the systems and the mechanisms and the processes to absorb, adapt, and transform. So when it comes to investment, when it comes to development, you've been talking about this all day long. Development, focuses generally on scale, where we're trying to reach the maximum number of people in the most efficient way possible, and that's certainly important. But scale, kind of looks at things like standardization, centralization, replicability, maximum efficiency, turnkey approaches that you can just flip a switch and you can turn it on. And that's how you reach scale. But for resilience, you need things like localization, you need context, you need decentralization, you need the linkages and the partnerships, you need to take time for consultation, you need the scoping that you need to do, all these things you've been talking about. And these kind of are in tension with each other. And while we need to achieve scale, if we're doing international development, we should never try to do that at the expense of resilience, because when that shock hits, if you ultimately create a system where you have an overwhelming dependence on a single commodity export, or a single trading partner, or a single monocrop, or a single authority figure, the things that really keep you able to reach scale really fast, when the shock hits at that single point of weakness, the entire system can break down real fast. So very quickly, our 7 dimensions that we look at with the index: inclusion. When people are socially, economically, and politically included, they may have less exposure to risk and vulnerability, are represented in decision-making, and have access to public resources to mitigate and respond to crisis and disasters. Social cohesion is similar to inclusion, but a bit different. Focuses not only on inclusion, but also on solidarity. So kinship ties, sociocentrism, opportunities. When you have social and political capital, you have more opportunities for generosity and collaboration, the kinds of things that are necessary for relationships and that will help you overcome a crisis. State capacity, that's a more traditional dimension of fragility as well, that we include in the State Resilience Index. Individual capabilities, when the average person has a stock of education, health, income, and food security, when the crisis hits, they won't be immediately rendered precarious, or reliant on social protection services or external intervention to survive. Environment, ecology, this is something that we're all familiar with. Economy, not just looking at sort of scale again, but diverse and innovative economies with access to capital. These are less vulnerable to price shocks and supply chain disruptions, and recover more quickly after a disaster. Civic space. This is different from the first two, inclusion and social cohesion, in that you can have a strong civic space and bad social and bad social cohesion, for instance, as you'll see we do in the United States, for example. But if you have a healthy public square that enables robust consultation, dialogue, debate, and consensus building, that allows for the kinds of collaborative decision-making and consensus building that you need in order to have buy-in to a national strategy. So kind of wrapping it up, The United States, for instance, if you can see, if here on the top right, this sort of shows you where we are on the spectrum across these different dimensions. You see we have a very robust civic space, which means that we have a lot of public debate, but we have relatively poor social cohesion, which means that the public debate kind of devolves into polarized disagreement and argument. So you need to have all 7 of these. This is just to illustrate the importance of all 7 in the index, and the way that you can kind of highlight areas of relative strength in a country like the United States, which does have a lot of strength, but then you have certain areas of critical weakness on the far left, which you need to be able to identify if you're going to be more resilient the next time a big shock hits, because, you know, as we've seen, a global shock hits about every 10 years or so. Finally, juxtaposing the fragile states index against the state resilience index, we've developed some models with SAS analytics running about 1,500 simulations to kind of identify which countries are most sensitive to which combinations of shocks in terms of being destabilized by them, and found it very interesting to see that in the United States, if you look across these 4 categories, should there be a shock to factionalized elites at the same time as you see a shock to state legitimacy, at the same time as you see a shock to demographic pressures, that would be the perfect storm in the United States, according to the modeling. And certainly that's exactly what happened in 2020. So just to illustrate, you know, the value of data to begin to kind of tease out what are some of the sensitivities that different countries might have to different combinations of shocks, and how this can be useful for prevention, so that we can get ahead of the shock, so that we're not laid flat the next time one rolls around. Thank you very much, Rosalie. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nate. And you know, it's so impressive to see what you have done with this. We at Partners Global and in our network are really excited about the index, because we are working with what we are, you know, many of you know, is the resiliency framework. And we also have 7, you know, we all like working with 7s, right? So the 7 factors that we're looking at to really think about organizational level resiliency, it's really interesting and necessary to juxtapose that with what's happening at a, you know, at a state level. And I think that this really begs the question for development and peace building work that we're doing, that we as actors are also kind of engaging with one another to understand whether the interventions that we're thinking of, say within civil society, specifically at the organizational level, how that interacts with what's happening, really looking at a state level a program or intervention. Like that integration and that interconnectedness is really important. So I very much appreciate that you shared that with us. It's a little bit of a preview, because I think the team at Fund for Peace is about to really kind of take this out to the public. And I think all of you will be able to dig more deeply into it for your countries in the next couple of months. So thank you for sharing that with us today. We are slightly over time, but I don't even see that as a negative, because it's been such a rich discussion. I think what we're going to do now is we will take 15 minutes for those that spoke to receive questions from the full group that is here. And I know some of you may have to leave and drop off. That's okay. Then we will take a brief break. There are some people that are in the office there. There will be a small coffee break there that will be reduced, and then we'll go into the small groups and really kind of dig more deeply into examples on the ground, what has worked, what hasn't, and see if we can come up with some, you know, recommended interventions or changes that can be presented as a group to some of the donors, again, as part of the advocacy. So I will open it up now. Let's try, go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. And I'm going to ask, I see Fahad has a question already. I'm going to ask maybe that Rasha, the team over there, also help me keep track of questions in the order. So Fahad in Yemen, it's floor is for you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosalie, and I would like also to present my thanks to everyone present in this call. My name is Fahad. I am the Deputy Director of Partners Yemen. Partners Yemen is a leading organization in Yemen in peace building, social cohesion, and capacity building for civil society organization. We have almost built the capacity of more than 50 local civil society organizations throughout Yemen. But unfortunately, I mean, as you know, Yemen has gone under a protracted war, which really impacted the situation and the civic space in Yemen. However, you can say the civil society organization have faced several challenges. Like, I mean, the conflicting parties imposed countless restrictions on activities, freedom of expression, media, and civil society organization movement. Also in human rights and humanitarian and development-related activities. Many of the local civil society organizations also have shut down or prevented from implementing projects, while others forced to go through long procedure and several official permits and approach before carrying any kind of activities. As a partners, Yemen, we have our own approach. Like, I mean, again, enforcing that, using the community participatory approach, using the dialogue, also enhancing the cooperation between the private and the public sectors and civil society organization to bridge the gap. Also bridging the gap between the civil society organization and religious actors, because the ongoing war have provided also the chance to the religious extremists to play also a role during the conflict and presenting further complication to the civil society organization and women and civil society organizations in Yemen. My questions in this regards, because as we are in a fragile security situation, we are in a failed state in Yemen. And we have seen like the USAID have suspended its activities in the northern areas, which also limited our, you can say, access and limited our effort to support civil society organization. And also, in addition to that, there is a lack of funding for Yemen currently because of the Ukraine war. So how the USAID can you can say support again or the civil society organizations in Yemen. In addition to that, really, I'm really excited also to reach to also Jesse from the Humanity United. And hopefully, I think that the Humanity United also can open the flexible grants for Yemen if that is possible, and then we can. I want to know if Yemen is one of your target countries so that we can approach you directly. My thanks also goes to the, you can say, Carolee. Also, I think we are interested also in knowing how to build our own internal structures and policies, and we want also to continue, I mean, reaching to you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Fahad. So I think it was 3 parts. So there was Aaron, and then Jesse, and then Carol.
So I'll be quick because unfortunately I can't answer that question because it is specifically a question that would have to go to our bilateral mission or my colleagues in our Middle East Bureau. But I'm happy to connect you with the relevant folks kind of offline to set up a conversation. But I'm so sorry that I can't answer that question in particular because my geographic focus is just exclusively on the Europe and Eurasia region.
Thanks, Aaron. So Jesse.
Yeah, so I can also be very quick in my response. Even though I used Colombia as a specific country, we actually don't fund by countries. Colombia was just an example where we have gone deep. So I can't say Yemen is a target country because we actually fund by themes, but within that, I mean, we're always open for conversation. So and for anyone else, here my emails in the chat. Feel free to email me. I know I'm inviting a slew of potential of emails, but happy to talk further about this. But for the sake of time, we'll gladly, happy to chat with you further.
So the good thing to know is that Yemen is not restricted, right? I guess that would be the question.
Yes, yeah. We don't restrict by country. We fund by theme. So it's not like we fund. So Colombia is an example. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was a bad example to give because we actually don't to do that in every context. But it was just one where I could kind of go deep and show all the different levels where we were funding. All the themes are represented in Colombia.
Perfect. Yeah. And then Carol, go ahead.
Very briefly, we do fund by region because we find that when we have a number of partners in one region, then we can build peer learning supports. And Yemen is not one of our regions. I regret it, but we're very small. So you can look on our website. I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So what we do have, though, is everybody who's on this call is aware Yemen has got a specific context that's been over 12 years now in conflict. So if you do know of other sources that might really be focusing on Yemen and not have those restrictions, share it here in the chat. And likewise for anybody else that has questions. So any more questions? And you can also just ask if it's too difficult to find the button to ask the question. There are 3 screens that I'm trying to track here. Rasha, I thought I saw a hand go up there, but I can't get back to it.
Maybe it was my hand saying everything is okay, but we can check.
I think Bridget has her hand up.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, that was somebody I saw. Bridget?
Sorry, I thought you're asking in the room. We're good in the room.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Bridget O'Loughlin. I'm the Business Development Director at Partners Global. So it's been such a rich discussion, and I'm so glad that we've had so many different representatives from different sectors and types of funders and implementers, and it's really been great. I was really struck, I think, by 2 points in the discussion. I think first, there was a lot of discussion of the role of intermediaries in localization. And I think the other thing that I really enjoyed was hearing from Sylvia on how Acento is really working to deconstruct those power relationships and really recognizing that there is a power relationship, among funders, intermediaries, and then going down to the local organizations that we want to be supporting. So I guess this could be a question to anyone who feels moved, but I'm wondering what are some of the best practices that you've seen to really hold intermediaries accountable to dismantling those power dynamics and making sure that, where there's a role for those types of intermediaries, that it's also not kind of creating even more barriers for local organizations. So apologies that I didn't ask anyone specifically, but anyone who feels moved would love to hear.
I'm happy to speak to that a little bit, because I think one of our challenge is that you can no longer have a single approach to this relationship. And we have to also acknowledge that what we're requiring is a level of flexibility, but even mental agility, in that you cannot have one definition of the role. And so someone who works in an intermediary organization will need to really engage with each partner in a different way, based on the context, based on the multiple constraints that partner may encounter, based on the level of experience and in negotiating or designing programs. And not only will that relationship will have to be absolutely customized by that context, it will have to evolve over time. So in the same way that mothers are accused of treating their children, their grown children, as if they were still teenagers, you cannot have one relationship remain the same. It needs to be constantly looked at, adapted, and engaged with true listening. The way to do that, I think, is to start every conversation, every phase of a collaboration with a conversation about roles, and that there's a true dialogue about who do you need me to be for you? How can I actually support you? Not coming from fixed role, not coming from projection, not coming from assumptions, but actually redefine these roles. And again, it may vary not just over time, but one partner may say, with this particular proposal, I feel comfortable, with this one, I don't. And yeah, you need, and while this takes more time, I think there are also ways to have these very important conversation as a sort of automatic thing. But that requires the willingness on the side of the intermediary to have real conversations and not just follow a protocol.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I see Erin has her hand up to respond.
Thanks, Rosalie. Just to build on what Carol said, I think those are excellent points. You know, for us at USAID, it does have a lot of dependency on how flexibly we are able to structure our agreements with those intermediary organizations, so that you can't have an intermediary just come back and say, well, USAID doesn't have that, you know, in our cooperative agreement or our grant with us, so I'm sorry, we can't fund that. So we have to, it starts from the very beginning between USAID and the trusted partner to ensure that we have that flexibility that's actually built into the agreement. And so we write our objectives very broadly. We have illustrative activities, and then we manage it on an ongoing basis through kind of an annual or a semi-annual work planning process that can then be adapted, you know, as needed. And if, you know, specific beneficiaries or subgrantees or partners then come out and say, we need this type of core support because, you know, there's no other funding available for us to really focus on our internal development, you know, without implementing a specific project, that we can consider that. Our partner can consider that and fund them kind of where they are. Similarly, if they need technical support in a specific area, you know, they have that intermediary organization has that capacity internally to be able to provide them with that technical support that they need, or to connect them with other groups in the region, which is often more likely to be the case, this kind of connectivity and shared learning across borders. So they can provide a multitude of types of services, again, to be responsive to where those local needs are, and not just revert back and say, oh, I'm sorry, it's not in our cooperative agreement, we can't provide that type of support. So I think that's really important. And then I agree, you know, on this kind of accountability loop, if you will, and that's why I think it's so important for you know, the actual like prime donor to go back and talk with the beneficiaries and the people who are receiving that support on the ground, to get feedback on how accessible they think the funding is, how open the intermediary was, how they feel like that dynamic is going. And so it's not just, you know, people operating in silos, but we really are talking to one another and making ourselves, you know, accountable to each other.
Thank you, Erin. I see Saddam's hand, so we'll take Saddam, and if there's one more question, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So Saddam, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for you all. I'll talk just about the resiliency and the sustainability of the CSOs. Actually, the local CSOs in Yemen, especially those who have wide experience in community reconciliations, conflict mitigation, human rights monitoring, and implementation, ceasefire monitoring, good governance, peace building, social cohesion. Such projects represent resiliency for local CSOs, national CSOs in Yemen, and as well as also the local communities, particularly minority groups, IDPs, and marginalized groups. However, as my colleague said, the global funding is hugely since the focus now more in the Ukraine-Russia war. Previously, the COVID-19 also was a factor of decreasing the funding for Yemen. As well as there are also some relations that play a core role in funding. Some of the NGOs are not according to the criteria. For example, those who have access to the donors in Amman or in Europe, they will get funded. But those who do not have access to the donors, they will not get the chance for funding. So these ignore the shortage of funds to Yemen. If it's not only the local CSOs, the national local CSOs, but also the grassroots local CSOs in the field. The projects which I talked about alleviated hugely and too much about the suffering of the people in Yemen. But if the shortage of funds continue and lack of funds for Yemen continue for a long time, that means the impact will be huge. The local communities will be affected. The local CSOs also will close. The grassroots local CSOs also will end their work because of the shortage of funds. I know resiliency approach suits more the countries which face crisis more than the countries that do not face crisis. Especially the countries who face the collapse of the regime, not only a small crisis, but the collapse of the regime and the militant groups are controlling the country while the country is divided into 5 parts. The sustainability of the local CSOs are very important so that they can support resiliency and the sustainability for the national local CSOs as well as the local CSOs. The impact will be huge if the projects and funding continues. But in the opposite, if the shortage continues, that means the local communities will face a lot of challenges, including the increase of clashes and confrontations between others.
Thank you so much for that. And if I can try to paraphrase, you know, it's, I think, less of a question, although it's open for a comment from anybody, but I would say that this is really a call for consideration when it comes to resilient funding, that the strategic decisions of where the funds are being targeted is particularly, you know, a very huge factor for those people and organizations that are in contexts where there's active conflict and where the funds have been, you know, have the risk of shifting or completely disappearing. And the point that you're making is then what happens with all of the investment that's been made within a civil society in a fragile state, you know, when the resources for that very, very fragile civil society disappear. I think I think we maybe want to have a separate conversation about that, and we can host another meeting, or somebody else in this group, if we want to continue, we can talk about this, because I do believe that it's not something that we can answer on this call, but it is a critical component of any consideration of what it means when we're talking about resilient funding. So that's just an attempt to paraphrase what you said, and I'll throw it out to the crowd. This is the last question or space for comment if anybody else has something to say about that. I know Yemen isn't the only place where this has happened, but it's certainly deeply being felt right now. If there are any other feedback that can come from those of you on the call.
We don't see any hands, Rosalie, virtually or in person.
Okay, then I'm going to put someone on the spot. So I'll say, for the donors that are there, you know, what would be an appropriate audience for this type of discussion, in your opinion, when we're talking about, thank you so much, Sylvia, I know you have to go, of how to address the migration of the funding based on these external factors? I would say it's very connected to the index. I don't know if Nate, you or Paul would, like have anything to say about that. Like if larger disruptions, right, that are outside of the control of civil society occur, what's that risk to civil society that resources will then be redirected? And how can we work together to have some kind of a preventative approach to, to have a safety net for civil society? Does anyone have any feedback on that?
I can jump in with just a minute, maybe reflecting a little bit of my time when I was at the State Department and doing some interagency coordination for similar types of environments. I think it really depends on the donor's interest globally, because you see some places become increasingly fragile to the point of failed, and there are massive investments of funding that come in for very extended periods of time, and those investments will really cover kind of the breadth and depth of what exists. So whether those are going to support government ministries or civil society activities, the birth of new areas within civil society, et cetera. But then if you look at other places that have struggled just as much, that for whatever reason aren't deemed maybe a threat to regional stability, or they just aren't registering in the interest of the major bilateral and occasionally even multilateral donors, typically what you'll see is a humanitarian assistance response, and that will be about it. I think that's something where we have a lot of opportunity to grow and evolve as a global economy, not a global economy, global community, to be able to try and figure out how we can help plant those seeds of peace, regardless of wherever we might be focusing.
Thanks so much, Paul. So Saddam, I think that this really is kind of a call for a deeper dive into this that we can do. There's a question that came from Oscar. I don't know if you want to just raise it. Last one for Carol. And just Marie-Laure, is GPAC, is there anything with GPAC that is touching Yemen?
We have a member in Yemen, and we've been working with few of them to secure funding for certain projects, including with UK, but to no avail at this point.
Yeah.
But
there may be some opportunity to collaborate.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Oscar?
Very briefly to I've put in the chat a resource which was put together by another few like-minded foundation, trying to again address our peers to show there are different ways to provide that kind of funding. And we have launched together a community of practice within the Philia, Philia standing for Philia Europe Association. It's a network of more than 10,000 foundations in Europe. And we've launched this community of practice to sort of, again, encourage and share our own practice. It's well attended. It's it's generating a lot of support. What we hear is that a lot of foundations take an interest. They sometimes go at it from a little bit of a traditional capacity building kind of angle, but they still are becoming aware of the need, and certainly the COVID pandemic has shown the need to invest in resilience in organization. What we find, and sort of connecting a bit to the Yemen situation, is that we often have conversation with program officers in their own attempt to convince their boards, with foundation boards often being quite risk averse, even though they have less legal restrictions than governmental one, and to sort of really also challenge that narrative and say, because we have less restrictions, we have to be more courageous, we have to take more risks. But it's not an always easy message. Hence the framing of saying this is actually a risk mitigation strategy. It's not high risk funding. It is absolutely necessary. And I would say not just for civil society, but for the political strength of a context. But so gaining momentum, still a long way to go. not that many that combine it with peace building either.
Thank you so much, Carol. So I don't see any other questions. If there are some in the chat, if the presenters can take a look at the chat and maybe respond there. There's so many good resources that have been shared just today. I want to thank you all. What we will do is just move right forward into a small group breakout sessions. I know it's been a lot of information and some people are more comfortable talking in smaller settings, but we do hope for those of you that are going to drop off now, that this will become, you know, an ongoing dialogue. We have partners, you know, Serbia within the programming that they're doing, you know, with us. They have a dialogue series on resiliency. We at Partners Global have a longstanding sort of roundtable series that we stopped during COVID, which was really looking at closing civic space issues. It's shifted a lot more towards resiliency. And I hope that we can all see each other here as partners and collaborators. It's not about competition. It's not about one funder or resources is superior. It's really kind of learning about what everybody can offer and making sure we can also spread the word within our networks, because civil society is under threat. This is what we all know. This is why we're all here. It's not looming in the future. It's in place. And I can just say from the point of view of Partners Global and our network, the reason why we began our resiliency work was because we felt it across the network. And so it is a thing, right? It requires a new set of skills, a new approach. We can't all resolve this independently, but we want this to be a forum for us to be able to really kind of help guide resources where they belong. And so thank you. Carol's also sending some more information about Oak Foundation. I think, Oscar, you were asking about some others maybe that provide some core funding. So I will say thank you to all of the presenters. Let's everybody give them a virtual clap or some kind of reaction. I'm going to give you guys a big, beautiful like party favor. I feel very deeply connected with you all now. So for those of you who are staying, I'm going to ask the team in DC, please, to instruct us of how we're going to be moved into our small groups for those who are going to participate in that portion. And for those who are leaving, thank you. Welcome to the network. We hope to continue this dialogue. And Urosh, oh, you gave a thumbs up. Thank you. So I don't know if it's Rasha. Can you instruct us for the next steps, please?
Sure. So thank you again for all speakers and thank you for the questions. We're going to split into groups, 4 groups, and we will have the people in the office. We're going to be one group as well. So now you will see a pop-up message coming to your screen, and we will have a facilitator and a team member in each of these groups. After we speak and we discuss what we have listened to from our experience in each group discussion, we can go back here and give like a quick debrief in 10 minutes, and then we can wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to just click join the room.
Thank you, Rasha. See you all in the room. I'm in room 3.
For the ones who are here, there's a little bird. We have some pastries and coffee.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm not sure if I'm still muted. Rasha, am I muted or do you hear me?
You're not muted. We can hear you.
Okay, so I want to welcome everyone back to this plenary. I know it's been a long discussion and we have maybe a couple of rooms that are still coming back. Welcome, welcome. Welcome back. I think most of us are coming back. Okay, so I know that probably felt a little bit like speed conversations. It wasn't enough time. Some of you were in mid-sentence and you had to come back. So again, we apologize for that, but what we hope is there's a lot of new friendships and a lot of new contacts that have happened in the conversation, and you can continue if we cut you off. So I want to just give us, Leo has her hand up. I don't know if that was from before. Okay, jump in, Leo, if you have a comment or a need. I just wanted to go ahead and, you're okay?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay.
I think
Leo's in Ghana, and I think maybe there's a little bit of a time gap there. So we had, I don't know how many groups, Rasha, did it break into 4 at the end?
So 4 virtual and 1 in person, so total 5.
Okay, so I don't know if we still have the group numbers that we were talking about yesterday. The group 1 I had as Matt and Mace. Was that still a group? Yep. Okay, would you like to go first and just debrief a bit?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rosalie. We were right in the midst of conversation and a lot of energy and interesting ideas. I'll try to be very brief just to be mindful of time. I think one of the core things that came out of the group was this idea that individual organizations really still feel like there are a lot of challenges about accessing the system, about feeling comfortable engaging and speaking forthrightly about the needs. And one of the kind of questions, ideas, requests would be for support and approaches to kind of stepping into the space and being more comfortable with this sense of risk about how do we say what we really need, even if it's not what we're hearing about the preferences from the donor community, and the comfort at speaking in that way and some way to acknowledge the experienced risk of that kind of interaction. So that's one thing. The second thing was an ongoing sense of competing agendas about kind of the way in which local organizations defined differently, map actors, make sense of local contexts, and define priorities. And the challenge when governments, international organizations, donors tend to have, at least at the larger levels, descriptions of different priorities and interests. And how can we either find ways to merge local interests with these large program priorities? And one of the approaches that came out of this challenge, this commonality, was identifying the importance of larger networks, coalitions, kind of strength in numbers, about finding ways to amplify the voice of local actors so that these needs, which may not necessarily be as present as we would like in these larger program requests, it feels like there's solidarity in the requests. Those are two of the patterns that came out in our discussion. And perhaps I'll stop there and we can come back to a second round if we have the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Matt. I can tell you that in our group, there's a lot of commonality there. So I see Mariam, your hand is up. Is that with a question or? Nope. I'm not hearing anything back. So Mariam, interrupt me if you wanted to speak. Group 2 I have here as Urosh, and I am not sure who the other facilitator was. Are you ready to go? Yep. You're still muted, whoever was with you, Uroš. I'm not sure if you were.
Okay, so Leonardo was with us. Do you want to present?
Leo and Uroš. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because your notes are quite thorough.
I'm not sure if Leo is having. Are you okay, Leo, with your hearing us?
It was okay in our group. We had a good connection. If not,
maybe let's try those of us that are still on video camera to take it off for a moment, because she's in Ghana and having some problems with the connection. Let's go off video for a minute. Leo, can you hear me?
So yes, I can hear you loud and clear. So in our group, it was quite a very interesting discussion. The discussion was like ranging from the beginning, the use of language and how donors are moving away from like languages such as aid to resources and support needed, rather than using the word help needed, and that this is really a resilience practice. Also, there was discussion about the fact that the huge overhead costs do not trickle or translate down from intermediary to the local organizations. And therefore, this is costing most local organizations to, or even intermediaries, to also think about whether they want to prime or be subs on projects. Since most funds for subs are directed more at programming costs than operational costs. There was also the discussion about the imbalance between local organizations, intermediaries, and donors, and the fact that there's not a bridge of access to donors directly by local organizations. And rather, intermediaries are creating country offices and sometimes not the conflict countries by neighboring ones. And this is reducing, and instead of implementing directly in the countries, they're implementing in the neighboring countries. And therefore, the donors are even not aware of the local organizations in the countries themselves. It went on to talk about how there's less operational costs that is budgeted for subs for projects, and this is affecting the program quality of the projects. Intermediaries have also, in certain conflict countries, have been accused of trying to westernize the approach to peace building, since donors follow what key implementers direct them with. And they often plan with limited recognition for the complexities of the situations and the systemic barriers that affect programming impacts. So we need to think about resiliency in a way that engages all kinds of local actors, and then utilizes media and religious discourse in a parallel form to while engaging in project planning and funding preparation. Another key point was that we should be mindful about the comparison of context when discussing resilience practices, because the contexts usually have different structural and cultural factors that determine the conflict situations within the countries. And internal practices of donor organizations must be reviewed to ensure that the political and programmatic practices do not negatively affect the abilities of CSOs with their access to funding. I think the last point in general was to also make sure that there's a funding contingency planning for funding that addresses risk mitigation. Even though there might be contingency planning for risk mitigation, there should be funding associated with that, and it should reflect in the strategic funding reviews.
Mm-hmm.
That's it in a nutshell. Over to you, Rosie.
You have been so thorough, all of you. I mean, that's like very compressed time, so I'm so impressed, and that just means how passionate everybody feels about these topics. So again, we will be able to discuss them more. Let's get the other two groups to share their points. So group, the third one, I guess, would be, I believe, Bridget, you and I. So Bridget, you have the floor.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be brief, and everybody please jump in if I miss something. So I think we had a great discussion. We had a great group. And I think the first point that we talked about was that I think that we've all observed kind of an increasing risk that we fall into more of a client service provider relationship rather than, you know, funder and beneficiary. So there's really a need to provide unrestricted funds that allow organizations to respond rapidly to windows of opportunity. And there was a theory in our group that these unrestricted funds are actually more impactful, provide more value for money than restricted project-based funding, you know, where there's not really this opportunity to respond to what's happening. There's a need for more trust in local implementers. We had a really interesting discussion about how anti-democratic groups, you know, provide their supporters with more leeway to operate, perhaps, than funders who are supporting democratic groups. You know, through this lack of trust and kind of huge reporting requirements, you know, a lot of oversight, a lot of guidance from the international community. We're losing credibility as democratic actors, and then intermediaries are losing credibility with local organizations. So how can we think about that and think about trust as an important component to the relationship? And another important component was talking about solidarity. You know, a lot of times there's not just funding needed, but political solidarity with democratic actors, with actors that are promoting peace building in their contexts, and kind of helping to support and protect these actors when they come under attack for their activities, rather than, you know, just funding. And then finally, you know, the old conversation of how can we diversify our funding sources a little bit to help us kind of get away from some of these constricting realities of the funding landscape. So briefly, that's it. And anyone else, feel free to jump in.
I think we can jump in at the group part. I think that was really well summarized. So 2 more groups, I'm sorry. So there's Paul and Deborah, I believe. I know that was going to be one group. Paul?
Hello, sure. Let me run through things fairly quickly and then ask Deborah to fill in any blanks. So I think we had a group that touched on some of the topics. I really like the fact that while there were some maybe constructive criticism that was dedicated to the existing system, there were conversations that took place representing kind of different countries around how to begin to try and support the transformation of that system. And that included not just engaging those within the system, but reflection on our own agency to be able to transform. And so what that looked like was kind of conversations around trying to hold the donors more accountable, engaging in relationships and conversations, et cetera, with them. And also there was a nice phrase that came from Kosovo about shifting from survival to surviving to thriving. And recognizing that at least I think in the short term that there has to be a compromise, that we can't wait for the donors to come to where we would like for them to be. There was a really helpful contribution around the idea of the lack of performance indicators trying to measure this growth in localization or in resilience of local organizations, and without that, can we really expect to see that transformative change that we'd like to have surface? I think this idea around transformation is one that appeared repeatedly throughout our calls. You know, recognizing the need for everyone involved to be better listeners. There was an idea that I think would work particularly well in more open societies around encouraging donors to act almost as an intermediary between the government and civil society. And I think that there were we were ending, I think, on a call for some good examples that are out there of donors that are really helping to kind of lean into this space of local resilience, and had a couple of things that were starting to surface there. I didn't do much service at all because it was a good, rich conversation. Deborah, was there a big piece or two that I missed that you'd like to weigh in with quickly?
Thanks, Paul. I think you summarized it beautifully.
Yeah, you got good points from your team. I think that's great. You know, it's really reassuring, right, that this was a combination of acknowledgement of some of the gaps, but also bringing forward, not only ideas of how to make the changes happen. And if we cut people off, please put it in the chat or send us emails, but also just the will and the desire to sort of be agents of that change as well. I think that's very important. And I really appreciate personally the need to be reminded of that, the agency and really the power of this community to have a demand-driven process move forward. So we have one last group, the Partners Global Conference Room contingent. So I'm not sure who took the notes there. If you could jump in with your notes.
Sure, Rosalie, I'll jump in. So we were, since we were in person, we were able to have a little coffee and enjoy a few snacks. So we had some side conversations in smaller groups, but when we came together as a group, we recognized until Pete joined us just a little while ago that we represented, either donor, intermediary organizations or, affiliated professionals. And so we didn't have the voice of a local implementer and until Pete came, and he was just in the middle of explaining his challenges when we had to stop. So we will continue, I think, after this and get his input. Generally, I would say that we had kind of two main points that were raised by two of our group. I think the issue that many of you have touched on about the role and the supposed role and responsibility and the reality of what intermediary organizations are doing was something that was raised. And the fact that it appears that donors are actually kind of using intermediary organizations to perhaps do the work that they themselves should be doing was maybe not raised directly, but something that I have been thinking about for a while. And just this idea of trying to square USAID's localization policy with the 25% goal of direct funding with the fact that the intermediary organizations are, kind of becoming part of that, or reinventing themselves or recasting what they are doing to be those that are actually still in the mix in a way that may not be most productive. We talked about also intermediary organizations who are seriously looking at how they are doing their work, and in particular we have one organization that has a emergency kind of lifeline project that providing support for organizations on the front lines with human rights issues, and the very real challenges of making sure that those funding goes to organizations without creating more harm, whether that's really not providing the kind of support that they would need internally to be able to accept the money, and then the fact that the inherent tension between emergency funding being very short term and how that actually can undermine sustainability and kind of long-term support. And the question was raised of what can we do, or what is the answer to move away from the reliance on funding, period. What are the ways, whether it's monetizing? We didn't really get into discussing too much of what the answer to that would be, but ultimately we are all looking for working ourselves out of a job, those of us who are in the intermediary role. And so how can that happen, and what are the ways that we can put local organizations in the best place to be able to move forward then without that continual reliance on donor funding. Anything else? Okay. All right. So that's where we are, and we will yes, we'll get all of this to the group and look forward to reading a little bit more about the resources that have been shared by the speakers. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Kira. So we are at 12:01. We're 1 minute over. So I really do want to respect everyone's time. But just to say, you know, I tried to make a like very small summary, but I feel like what that last group talked about was kind of covering all the bases. What I would want everyone to know is that what we intend to do after this is we have the recording. That recording will be shared with everyone, and I know we had a French speaker. We'll get that into French as well, and any other language that is needed in order for this to be as democratically shared as possible. The wrap up that I have is really just like, here are my notes, and I'll try to read them back like within 1 minute. So big things that I think we kept repeating was that it really is necessary still to have kind of, at least at the country levels where we're all working together, like some definition of what we mean with resiliency and resilient funding, and that there's a bit of a, you know, a discord there. And that's, again, kind of directly looking at funders themselves and how challenging it is to be in a civic space when all of the funders sort of have a different way of approaching this concept of, you know, a more localized funding approach. And I think we all have that responsibility to work with the donors and remind them that that's an issue. A lot of structural improvements that we have been bringing up that we will share and make recommendations of and kind of compile in kind of a categorized way. Not to forget the contextual factors in every single place that we're working, and that can be a country context, but it can also be very much a micro context. So I heard a lot of people just reminding one another that no matter what, we've got to kind of start with that like reality check of where we're working and figuring out what's needed. Big thing I was hearing was accountability mechanisms, right? So that doesn't have to be bureaucratic, but I think there was a lot that was shared both on the funder side as well as on the implementer side to say that there's progress, right? There's the will, there is the intention, but maybe it's still not quite automatic for those implementations of change to then have an evaluation and to go back to those that are like the worker bees that are doing the work with those local recipients to say, is this actually working? So there may be perception that there's been, you know, an improved process or change to the complexity of what is being required, but actually, you know, we're not necessarily going in and making sure that that assumption is true. And then the role that everybody here has to represent those organizations that are like less likely to be at the table. So that agency that we have to sort of remember we carry and to bring that forward in groups like this. You know, and the last thing I wanted to mention was, I think Nate was saying, it surprised me that, you know, if I got it right, every 10 years, we can expect some type of an external disturbance, right? That will come and hit us at least at a nation state level, at a country level. So that's a reality. And that's beyond all of the other types of disturbances that we're talking about that are really impeding many of us from functioning as well as we could in the civic space. So that's a reality, which means that we do have to have those contingencies that we're working on actively as organizations. And to do so, the funding cannot just be project-based funding. We've got to be really advocating for broader unrestricted funds across the board. So, you know, that's sort of my attempt at a quick takeaway of some of the bigger themes. We will be reaching back out to everybody, and we do hope that we will be able to continue convening in some way, and maybe that would be a rotation if any of you are interested. There's a lot more conversation to be had. And just to give one plug, I think we saw yesterday that DevX, for those of you who are members or are familiar with DevX, we can put it in the chat. They're going to be having a conversation looking at sort of the topic of funding for international development programs as well. Bridget, you might know the exact date, but certainly there's another forum. The 6th of December. Yeah, so we'll share that out with all of you as well. But We see this as the beginning of a larger conversation, and I want to thank everyone. If there's anyone that has any last comments they want to make, feel free. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for sharing this day with us, and good luck with your work. Let's continue to try to be as resilient as we can in these complicated times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosalie.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much.
Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
afternoon and evening.
Thanks to all of our speakers as well. Sorry, and our facilitators, as well as our interpreter and all the team that made the tech possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Rasha. Hi, Mariam. Are we here? I am trying to read the name that we have. If you can hear us, we're gonna have a planning meeting. So whenever you're ready, you can log off the meeting.